Coming up on the Purposeful Podcast.
What a lot of people aren't talking about yet is insurance, homeowners
Ooh.
insurance, and car insurance. That has definitely shot up 20, 30%, maybe 50% in some cases.
Yep.
A little bit of a different classification of insurance, like anything with flood insurance, which is big in our area, that's gone up 500 to 1,000% in a lot of cases in
Yeah.
6 months. So my advice to everybody is you really got to pay attention.
Welcome to the Purposeful Podcast. I'm Matt.
And I'm Saki.
We're very glad to have you with us for this episode. We're going to be talking about inflation that continues to be a significant issue that is impacting everybody right now. And then we're also going to go back to the basics a little bit and talk about APR and what interest rates mean and how to read that stuff when you see your credit card statement or your car statement, things like that. But before we get started with that, we're going to try a new segment tonight to kick things off. And the basis of it is that, a lot of people hear about greedy capitalists and, business people are just in it for the profits and so on and so forth. But the truth is that there's a lot of philanthropy out there. So we'd like to bring to your attention some noteworthy giving. And so tonight, I'm going to pass this over to Saki and let you tell us about the philanthropist that you saw this week.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Matt and I were discussing this earlier, and wealthy people, business owners, CEOs, they get a bad rap sometimes, as just being bad people because, we all have, or they all have money and, they're just bad for having money. But we overlook the good things they do and what money allows people to do, which it allows you to give back. So earlier today, I was reading an article, and a lot of our listeners may have heard about it as well. But I wanted to highlight what Dolly Parton's doing. She has somewhere around 11,000 employees, full-time, part-time, administrative staff, top to bottom, at her Dollywood amusement park. And she has come out and let everybody know that she will pay for 100% of their college education, regardless. All 11,000 employees, full-time, part-time, doesn't matter. She's covering tuition. She's covering books. She's covering everything, top to bottom. And I think she should be applauded for that.
And that's outstanding. If you have college-age kids, you might want to send them up to get a job in Sevierville, Tennessee.
Exactly. Well, think about it. One of the things that money allows us to do is to give back. And that's actually one of the most important things it does. And she is tackling one of the biggest pandemics and crisis we've ever faced in this country, and that's student loan debt, college debt. Right. And she's decided for 11,000 people, she's going to make a change. So it's pretty cool.
Well, way to go, Dolly Parton. Fantastic.
Good for you.
Good on you, for sure.
Yep.
Well, that's a great one. I will try to pick next week's story. But just to review real quick, for this episode, we are going to get into inflation, and we're going to talk about how APR works. But before we do that, we are going to kick this out to our intro.
You're listening to the Purposeful Podcast with Matt Fiebig and Saki Filios.
All right, brother. So inflation is still red hot. I know when we talked about this during our last episode, they were expecting something around 7.3% annual inflation, and it actually came in at 7.5. Well, shortly after that report was released, another report was released showing that producer prices were up at an annual rate of 9.7%, which
Wow.
means the pain is going to continue most likely. So I've also seen, where real estate is still super strong, expected to remain super strong, even with interest rates rising. So what are your initial thoughts when you heard about the producer price index coming in at 9.7 annualized rate?
When will it end? That's probably what my initial thought was. I mean, how high can we keep going? We're really getting to that point where it could get a little bit out of control, right? I mean, I think the month year over year for January was 0.6. Am I correct in that?
That's right on the retail side.
Yeah, on the retail side. And if on the real estate side, it really affects me and what I do every day. And if you're a builder or anybody that deals with lumber, it's affecting you as well because lumber has shot back up. Just to give you an example, 2-3 months ago, OSB, half-inch sheet of OSB was back down to $16. Now it's back up over $30.
Wow.
And just to kind of put that in context, that's almost 100% jump, right? In 2 months, 60 days. But 2 years ago, that was at $6. So it kind of shows you where we were to where we went back down to. So we, as an individual and as a consumer, I mean, 9.7%, is that what you said?
Yeah, on the producer price index, 9.7%.
Yeah. I mean, think about that. That cost will get passed on to us. I imagine that probably lags behind a certain amount of time. Once it gets passed on to the middleman, and it gets passed on to us. So start buying your stuff in bulk, your consumables in bulk, and hold on.
Yeah, well, that's good advice. In fact, that was the advice that we were talking about last week, and then I decided that it was good enough to follow. So my wife and I went shopping, and it's just the two of us in our household, so a little bit goes a long way. But we figured there's so much uncertainty, and I'll tell you one thing that's contributing to that right now also is these the truckers, right? So you've had a group of truckers in Canada that traveled all the way to the capital in Ottawa, and they've had their protests going on there now for I think almost 2 weeks or maybe even longer, as part of this trucker convoy protest, which they've been protesting the mandatory COVID shots for the drivers, especially traveling into the United States and back. A group had blocked off some of the main thoroughfares in between Canada and the United States. One of them going into Michigan, and another one of them, I want to say, was southern Alberta going into Montana. And so, basically, travel between the two countries has more or less been frozen now for a little while. So imports and exports have gone through a temporary freeze, and that just exacerbates some of these supply issues that we've had. So thinking about that, I've been kind of paying attention to the news, and I see where there are some folks in the United States that are planning a similar convoy for next month. So if that happens to go through, there may be even more supply disruptions. The trucking industry is already in need, you might say, of drivers. There aren't enough over-the-road drivers for the demand right now. So, in addition to that leading to higher prices, because drivers are more expensive per load, right? But it also means fewer goods are being moved than might otherwise be the case. And of course, that also contributes to supply shortages, which drives up prices. And as long as people have the money to spend, demand is going to remain high. So I say that for two reasons. Okay. One reason is definitely think about at least getting yourself ready for the next couple of months. When the COVID lockdowns started going into effect a couple of years ago, all of you remember you couldn't find toilet paper to save your life. There were just some things you couldn't get a hold of. Something like that hopefully won't happen again, but if it does, you want to act in moderation. Don't buy so much that your neighbors and your family can't go and get some too. We'd encourage you to be conscientious about that, but don't get caught short either. You need to have enough to at least last a few months. So think about that. But the second reason that I bring it up is because I wanted to discuss with you, Psyche, there's a lot of information out there that people are saying, okay, well, this is the reason that inflation is high. No, this is the reason that inflation is high. So I want to try to tease out some of these contributing factors and see if we can get to the bottom of it. So one of the things is the supply shortages, right? So you hear some people say, well, I think inflation is actually going to cool off a little bit as time progresses because the kinks that were in the supply chain as a result of all the COVID stuff, those are going to start to work themselves out, smooth out. And as the supply chain gets moving again, inflation should ease somewhat. You've also got a different group of people that are saying, well, it's not just the supply chain, or maybe it's not even the supply chain. It's the fact that over the course of the last 2 years, the government has borrowed trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars and basically flushed all that into the economy. So there's a massive influx of cash into the economy. So a lot of people have money to spend. So that's driven demand very high. And then you've got people that have talked about, interest rates have been relaxed for far too long and money is cheap, which is different from being plentiful. Money being cheap means it's easy to borrow. And they'll say that's what's going on that's causing the inflation. So based on what you see and based on your thoughts and experience, I'd like to know kind of where you stand with all that and how you expect things to play out maybe in the next year or two.
Yeah, certainly. So this might not clarify it for everybody, but I think it's a little bit of all of it, right? I think it started when COVID came and we started locking down and people, shut down. We stopped working pretty much as a country. And there were certain products and items that just weren't being manufactured anymore. And there's a lot of products and items that people were trying to just go buy in bulk and hold on to. So you were seeing shortages. Then as that happened, which was unprecedented for us, right? We'd never been through that as a country. Our reaction to that as a country was, let's kind of deploy a lot of money into our economy. Let's get it kickstarted again. So that further created an issue because now you've got more dollars in the system and people are spending. And if they're out there spending, they're out there buying. And if they're buying, you're not going to have enough supply where you already don't have enough supply because everybody's shut down. So now that created more of a demand because now the average person had more savings in their checking account, in their lifestyle, right? They had more money in their pocket from the money. It's been proven from reports. So what do people do when we have more money? The average human person spends more. So now we're locked down, we're spending more with this free money. And as the economy rolls back up again, then another strike of COVID. So some we get partially shut down, and we go through this for 2 years. Well, meanwhile, while we're doing this for 2 years, we do have easy money, as you call it. Interest rates have been artificially lowered to keep money flowing through the system. What people need to remember is our system is based on consumption. That's how we function as a country. If we don't buy, it falls apart. Sure. So that we're based on that. We have to spend money as the consumers, the general public. So all of that has led to where we are right now. And if you look back, there's always a period every 20, 25 years or so where the multiple of items change and the price that you pay for certain products you're used to is just going to change. It is inevitable in a society like ours. And, we've all heard the stories of our grandparents say, yeah, you could buy, a gallon of milk for $1.05 or something, or you could get a loaf of bread for a quarter. Well, yeah, grandpa, you can't do it for a quarter anymore, but I think we're seeing that, right? I think things are going to change.
Well, one of the interesting things, and we are on an upcoming episode, we're actually planning to talk about Bitcoin in depth, and specifically as it relates to fiat currency, because that's one of the things that really separates Bitcoin maybe from the rest of the crowd, is that as to this point in time, there is still only going to be a finite amount of Bitcoin. And as long as that's the case, then it's going to be extremely stable over time because you can't create more of it. When we talk about the Federal Reserve, the standing policy at the Federal Reserve for quite some time has been to keep inflation somewhere around 2%. What that really means is that over time, the value of the dollar, their goal is to decrease the value of the dollar by about 2% a year indefinitely. And that's stable enough not to disrupt the monetary markets, but it's also loose enough to encourage spending, which promotes growth. I think that's the general argument there. The thing about that over time is it is the policy of the Federal Reserve and of the United States that your money is going to become less valuable over time. That's an important thing to know, because especially if you ever plan on retiring and you ever get to a point where you're on a fixed income, yeah. If you plan on being retired for 20 or 30 years, which is not unreasonable for a lot of people anymore, what you have has to grow with you at a rate that exceeds the rate of inflation, or you're going to be losing ground. So that's a significant point. But you really want to understand that, because your expectations need to be aligned that, you're not just trying to grow 7% a year on your investments. You're not just trying to grow 7% a year just as an arbitrary number, but you have to take into account that inflation is going to occur because the government wishes for it to occur. So you really want to target your growth accordingly. The issue that we're having now, obviously, is that we're way above 2% inflation. So, yep. When you're talking about grandpa, I'm like, getting a little gray here, getting more than a little gray here. And just to verify how old I am, I remember as a kid when unleaded gasoline, first of all, I remember when there was leaded gasoline, but I remember when the price of unleaded gasoline was around 81 cents a gallon.
Yep.
So, we're out driving around today, and in our little corner of Northwest Florida, it's back into the 345 range, which is painful. Just drives home the point, though, that not everything is inflating at the same rate. And so I want to throw that back to you here for a minute. Don't you think that this really warrants everybody taking a little bit of time to examine how inflation is going to impact them personally for that reason? If you happen to be the kind of person who commutes, say, 45 minutes a day by car, and you're putting a lot of mileage on your vehicle, the fact that gas prices are up something like 50% in the last 18 months, that's a significant impact on your pocketbook. That's a lot more than 9% or 7%. If you are in that kind of a situation, the inflation is going to impact you a little bit differently. So what are your thoughts about how inflation rates impact different parts of the economy?
Well, first I want to respond with, I remember when I was 16 and I got my first vehicle, buying gas and filling up my tank with loose change in my pocket. So, $1 or $2 went a long way back then.
All right, Grandpa.
Exactly. There you go. What's interesting about that question you asked is, I kind of feel like our government's a little out of touch, right? Yeah, they released his report.
Right.
That can't be right. We hear these numbers, 7.5%, 9.5%, and they're very high numbers. Historically, I think that 7.5 is the highest since the 80s, I believe, early to mid 80s, 22 years, more than that, something like that.
40 years, basically, yeah.
Yeah. But it, like you mentioned, it's a lot higher than that in most categories that we actually use on a day-to-day basis as the average consumer. Our food items, our grocery store items, our car, our vehicle purchases, our home purchases. You could find in our area 1 year ago, you could get a very good house for less than $200,000. I mean, you could have a family home with 3 bedrooms for $180,000. Now you're lucky to find one with 3 bedrooms for less than 300.
Yeah.
So it's really shot up. That's not 9%.
Well, yeah, I mean, the value, I bought this house, my wife and I bought this house about 2 years ago. And the price per square foot that we paid for it versus the price that we would probably get for it today. In fact, our next door neighbor just sold their house. And if we got anywhere near the price per square foot that they got, we'd actually be up a little over 50% in 2 years.
Think about that. And the average home should see or realize a 3% inflation, they say, for real estate. So my point was there is, as a household, that number's actually exaggerated. I think on a day-to-day basis, you, me, our listeners, we're experiencing 20% inflation with our consumable items we have. What a lot of people aren't talking about yet is insurance, homeowners insurance and car insurance. That has definitely shot up 20, 30%, maybe 50% in some cases. A little bit of a different classification of insurance, like anything with flood insurance, which is big in our area, that's gone up 500 to 1,000% in a lot of cases in 6 months. So my advice to everybody is you really got to pay attention. I go back to what we've said in previous episodes because it's more important now than ever. You really got to pay attention to your personal balance sheet And when I say personal balance sheet, pay attention to the money that's coming in and the money you're spending and where you're spending it at. You know, focus on one side of the equation at a time. If you're gonna, if you have X amount of dollars, well, put your focus on where you spend your money and how you spend it. Once that's done, if you still have a negative balance there, a negative result, well, go make more income somehow. So that's what I would say to people. But you have really got to pay attention. You can't just, over the past few years, we've gotten a little bit lackadaisical as a society, and we really spent more money on what we call entertainment category, right? We spend more money to entertain ourselves than we really ever did in history. Well, the times here where we probably have to kind of rein that in a bit and pay attention.
Right. Well, so that brings to mind quite a few thoughts. You talked about the personal balance sheet, and so we've discussed this in the past on this podcast, where you've got, kind of two different ways of looking at your personal finances. One is your income and your expenses. So obviously you can increase your income, you can decrease your expenses. The other thing that we've talked about is assets and liabilities, right? And inflation really has an impact on that. When I talk about the price of my house, basically, or the value of my home increasing by 50% in the last 2 years, that's an increase in the value of an asset. One thing that's interesting is that if you got a car loan 2 years ago and your car loan was at 2.5%, which was a pretty common rate back then, if you had really good credit, think about that right now. When inflation is so high, the value of the car that you bought 2 years ago might actually be stable. It might be worth as much or more now as it was when you paid for it. And then the debt actually is cheaper now, because the value of the dollar that you borrowed 2 years ago is now, you're paying it back with dollars that are worth less than what you borrowed.
Yeah.
So the fact of the matter is that inflation can be very harmful, but it can also be it doesn't have to always be completely a negative thing. What you want to think about, if you're out there trying to navigate this, is can you get yourself into assets that are going to appreciate more quickly than the average rate of inflation, like real estate? Okay. That's one of the things that makes real estate attractive. To do that, though, and this is going to be somewhat counterintuitive, especially because of the point that I just made about debt, but you actually want to get yourself out of debt if you can, because your cash flow is that much more important. Because if you're paying off liabilities, if you're paying off debt, then you don't have the resources to invest in the kinds of assets that are going to help you rise faster than the tide of all the rest of the boats. So even though, you might argue, well, if I took a loan today and I could borrow at 5%, and I know that inflation is probably going to be up around 7 or 8 or 9%, then, isn't that a good thing? Shouldn't I do that? Well, no, especially if you're talking about consumer debt, and especially like a car loan, even, because you're really probably overpaying for the car. So if it wasn't something you were already going to do, you probably want to avoid that. But if you've ever thought about getting into, a rental property or something like that, prices are high for sure. But the thing about the real estate is, if you get into that kind of a property, you can actually earn cash flow every month by renting it out, putting it to use, and the value of the asset climbs over time. So if you are able to think about this the right way, you can actually put yourself in a position to succeed in a time of high inflation. And I think that's important for everybody to think about.
Yeah, I agree 100%. There's different kinds of debt. You can have debts on assets or you can have debts on liabilities. And a vehicle is not an asset. If you're a car dealer, maybe, you're doing these short-term loans as a car dealer to buy and sell cars. Well, that's how you make your living. But as an individual, my car that I purchased for me to drive around is not an asset. 99.9999% of the time, you will never see an increase in value. And not only that, you'll see a huge decrease in value the minute you drive it off the lot. So that what you said is 100% spot on. But if you wanted to take this opportunity in a rate of inflation to invest in an asset, now is the time to do that. So it kind of clarifies, I think, what you were talking about. And I'll go a little bit further with the personal vehicles. If you're somebody trying to get to the next step or next stage, and earlier you had mentioned if somebody was driving a long way to work, had a 45-minute commute or something. Let's say they have a truck or a vehicle, whatever it is, that gets them 15 miles to the gallon.
Right.
Or they have an older vehicle. Now is the perfect time to get out of that vehicle. Let's say they're under on that vehicle. That's a very common issue. You owe more money than it's worth. Now's the time to sell that vehicle, downgrade in your choice of car, maybe get something that has better gas mileage. I've seen people save hundreds of dollars a week just by getting something more efficient on gas.
Yeah.
And that's the first step I would do with that car. Then a second thing is sell something. That way you get out of the red on it and then buy something a little bit cheaper.
On demand for trucks and SUVs is sky high right now. So if you are actually looking to get out from underneath a vehicle like that, and you can move yourself into a sedan, or maybe like, if not a mid or a full size, maybe even a compact, you're going to see huge savings just on the fuel mileage. You could go from 15 or 16 miles a gallon all the way up to, 30 or even more, which will be a significant impact on your fuel. But, cars are still relatively less valuable compared to trucks and SUVs. So you're actually going to, if you sell a truck to buy a car, you're going to be working that in your advantage as well from a financial point of view. So that's definitely good advice. I want to bring this back around though. We're talking about fundamental causes for inflation and the different factors that contributed to that. So before we wrap this topic up for this particular episode, because obviously we can go on and on and on, and we may for future episodes, but do you see supply chain issues mitigating? Do you see monetary policy having an impact on inflation? Do you see government spending having an impact on inflation? Like, to your best guess, kind of where is this train headed?
So circling back to start answering that question, one, this is a natural progression, right? The government, as you stated, builds in a 2% inflation rate annually. That's what they want. And we kind of need that, right? We do need a certain level of inflation. People need raises. Companies, money needs to increase. If it stayed static, you'd never make any more money. No, nothing would ever grow. And that's not really how you would want to live. But it's going to be an interesting thing to see. I don't have a crystal ball, but it will be very interesting to see what happens with the interest rate hikes, because that's going to be the game changer when we talk about monetary policy. Depending how the Fed handles raising the interest rate is going to have a big effect on how inflation does. Now, the supply side, to get to that point, we have a lot more consumers that have entered the consumer marketplace, right? So that's one thing I don't think a lot of people are talking about. We had a whole nother generation. Gen Z came into the fray, if you will. So now we have millions of Gen Zers that are hitting, getting done college. And that's what's helping to create all this as well. It's something I wanted to touch on earlier, but I got off track on that. So that's another big factor to consider. So that's going to affect the supply side, I think, for at least the near future, because demand is higher because of that. So we need more supply. And I just don't think the workforce is there to meet that supply, or excuse me, to meet that demand. And then on top of that, when the interest rates come into play, it's hard to say, man. It's let's put it this way. I'm glad I don't have the job of deciding when and how to raise the interest rates.
Well, you and I might have slightly different opinions about whether or not 2% annual inflation is a good thing. But we'll explore that in the future. I think for now we're going to have to wrap this up, or we're never going to get to our second topic. And we want to do that. So let's talk about APR. This is really kind of let's take a beginner track. If you're somebody who's not really familiar with financing and debt and interest rates and all that, and that's all a little bit of something that makes your head spin, where do you start? How do you start to understand what this means?
So I highly recommend if it's in regards to a house purchase or something sizable like that they talk to an independent mortgage broker and understand that. But you can do a typical Google search, and just go through your due diligence to understand. There's a lot that goes into APRs and yield. So APR obviously is annual percentage rate, and then you have your yield, which is the annual percentage yield. And a lot of times that rate is what people pay attention to, right? And it looks lower than the yield, and it's going to be lower, right? So if you're looking for a loan and you're searching around the internet and then you pull something up, you might be looking for just the lowest rate, but that's not necessarily what you should be looking for, because you want to look at your total yield and see that number should be the lowest, because there's closing costs, fees, taxes, all sorts of things that they roll into that yield.
Well, okay, so clarify for us a little bit what goes into the yield calculation.
So let's
versus
say
what goes into the APR.
Yeah, so let's say we're talking about closing cost. Well, the annual percentage rate might be, just say 2.5%. Well, the yield might actually be higher because they're rolling other fees and costs into that. And there's points that the mortgage lenders are charging brokers or whoever have you, the middleman. So that's how the middleman makes money, right? So that
Right.
yield, that middleman sells you this loan or does the paperwork for the loan. Let me rephrase that. Processes the loan under and he sends it off to the bank, whoever has it. And the way he makes it is he might get 0.2%. So that 2.5% now becomes 2.7 because his cut gets added onto that. Then the bank, who typically underwrites your loan for a home mortgage, they're going to sell that. And they want to have a little bit of a kicker in there for themselves, because they want to be able to discount that and sell it to another bank, because they're not going to pay full price. So now they're going to add a little bit to that annual percentage yield. That might be another 0.2. So that 2.5% becomes 2.9 annually, which seems insignificant, but on the average home price of $300,000 over a 15 or 30-year mortgage, it adds up.
So really the difference between the APR and the APY is that the APR is going to be based on the actual item that you're purchasing, be it a home or a car, whereas the yield is going to include the loan origination fees and all the associated fees that might get rolled into that. So sounds to me like it would be good advice to, if you're saving up for a home, for example, not only to have a certain amount that you can put down, but also factor in that if you can pay those fees up front, then you're not going to have those roll into your loan. And so your APR and your APY are going to be a lot closer together,
Yep.
which is what you want. So, it really stinks to have to pay somebody to originate your loan and then pay them compound interest over a long period. And that makes me think about another significant issue that a lot of people don't understand or don't think about. And that's the difference between a closed-ended loan and an open-ended loan. So a closed-ended loan, for example, would be a car loan. Let's say that you're buying an automobile and you're financing that with a loan, and the term of your loan is 60 months. So what they do is they fund that loan and then they amortize your payments based on 60 payments over the course of one per month for 5 years. That loan has a termination date. If you make your payments on time every month for 60 months, you pay off the balance completely. An open-ended loan does not work that way. Let's say that we're talking about a credit card, for example, which is where most people are going to encounter an open-ended loan. You're paying interest every month. It's not calculated annually. It's compounded monthly, okay? And it never ends. So there is no termination date that says, oh, well, you put $3,000 on this credit card. If you pay X amount for the next 36 months, you'll pay that down to zero. You can decide how much to pay as long as it's at least the minimum payment. But the problem is if you only pay the minimum payment, you're never going to pay it off. That's not technically true, but it might as well be. I mean, if you pay your minimum credit card payment, you'll probably carry the balance for something like between 15 and 20 years if you do nothing but pay the minimum payment. That depends, of course, on your interest rate, but open-ended loans tend to have much higher interest rates as well, partly because they're not collateralized. If you borrow a loan, if you take out a loan and borrow money to purchase a car, the car is collateral for the loan. So if you default on the loan, the person who owns your note can collect that car from you, sell it, and at least make some of the money back. So the risk of a total loss is not as high. On an open-ended loan, typically you're purchasing consumables, which are non-recoverable, and there is no collateral. So your interest rates are going to be a lot higher because the risk of loss is significantly higher. So on a car loan, for example, you might pay, 2.5%, 3.5%, 4.5%. If you've got pretty good credit, you might pay as high as 10 or 15% if you don't have good credit, which is almost obscene for a car loan. But a lot of people pay close to 30% on their credit cards. That is obscene. I mean, that's ridiculous. And payday loans are even worse when it comes to interest rate. Those can be as high as 90 to 100%. So you really have to be careful what kind of debt you take out. And in addition to understanding what your APR is, it's critical that you understand is this a closed-ended loan or an open-ended loan? If it's closed-ended, how long is the term? And I'll kick this back to you for a second, but you've talked a lot about 15-year mortgages. This is where that comes into play, 15 versus 20 or 30-year mortgages.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of the 15-year mortgage. You save tens of thousands of dollars in interest, and it could be more than that, depending on the size of the purchase. But I'm always a fan of the shorter term, get it paid for, pay less interest, and acquire your asset. Another plus of doing a shorter term, no matter what you're doing, whether it's a house, a car, any kind of large purchase like that, even a non-secured loan, a personal loan like you were talking about, the shorter the term, generally the lower the interest rate you will pay, right? On a 15-year mortgage, you're going to get a lower rate than you are in a 30-year mortgage.
Right.
And why is that? And well, it makes complete sense. The person doing the loaning is getting their money back faster. So if they get their money back faster, it's a less risk for them. You get the benefit and pay a little bit less interest. So I highly recommend the shortest term you can get. You had touched on payday loans. Stay away from payday loans. Some states, they're outlawed. I know in Florida they are, in Alabama they're allowed, and they are legally allowed to charge you 25% per month interest. That amounts to 300% a year. So
Yeah.
if you borrow $1,000, you got to pay them $250 in interest per month before you touch the principal. So yeah, stay away from them. I had somebody come to me at a public event I was at not too long ago, and they said, well, they told me the story. They had $4,800 worth of credit card debt, and they paid the minimum every month. I'm pretty sure he told me, I think he said it was 11 years it took him to pay that credit card off. And I think it was almost 20,000 or something like that he ended up paying. I mean, you want to talk about obscene. And and the credit card companies don't want you to pay it off, right? That's what they want you to do. But really, definitely pay attention to that.
That's where APR can be a little bit confusing, because if you only compare APR and you don't factor in some of these other things, you think, oh, well, if I take out a 15-year mortgage and it's 2.8%, or I take out a 30-year mortgage and it's 3.5%, I mean, is 0.75% or 5/8%, is that really that big of a deal? Well, yes and no. I mean, if you were comparing a 15-year mortgage to another 15-year mortgage, then half a point of interest it's not insignificant, but it's not nearly as much of an impact as what you'd see if you talk about a 0.5% of interest difference between a 15-year mortgage and a 30-year mortgage.
Yeah.
The thing that people talk about, and this is how they try to sell you on it, is, can you afford this monthly payment, without thinking about how long you actually have to make that monthly payment. People get into the mindset that, oh, well, I will just make that monthly payment forever. I'll just permanently set aside part of my budget to service debt. Well, that's not a good mindset. You want to completely get out of that mindset and think to yourself, okay, well, how much money am I going to save if I bite the bullet and pay a higher monthly payment, but I cut my term down?
Yeah.
If you're buying a new car and you're thinking about financing it for 72 months or 84 months or even 96 months, some of these lenders are doing now.
Yeah.
A 96-month term versus a 48-month term is thousands of dollars of interest, even at identical APRs. So you really got to think about that. And a credit card that might be at, say, 7% APR, that's going to work out very differently than a car loan at 7%. So,
Hey, Daisy.
oh, that's cute. Doggy kisses. So anyway, definitely food for thought. And if you don't know a lot about it, you definitely want to learn about it before you borrow. So with that, let me ask you, do you have any final thoughts for this episode?
Yeah, I would like to touch on you were speaking about car loans there. And that's something I really want to get across to our young listeners out there. I highly recommend, if it's possible, pay for your car outright. Don't get a car loan. Don't finance a car. I'm not a big fan of debt on liabilities, and that's what a car is. However, a quick story I'll just say. So I had a 20-year-old kid come to me, in the community here that I've known for some time. He's needed a vehicle, and I've tried to kind of help him with a search. And I said, hey, you're 20 years old. You're not driving long distance. Your work is a couple miles from your house. Let's just go find a car for a couple $1,000s. You can learn to work on it yourself and fix it up. It builds a lot of life values and lessons that we've all had to do, right? It's how we learned. And that is a good way. I do recommend it. You learn how to save money along the way, and you don't get yourself in debt. Well, I just heard from him the other day, and he says, I just got a car. I said, oh, great. Excited. I said, how much did you pay for it? And he said, well, here's the thing. I financed it. I went to this lot and I financed it. I said, how much did you pay for it? He said, I'm not sure. I said, how long is your loan for? He said, I'm not sure. I said, well, what do you know? He said, I know I'm paying $530 a month. So that I say that story because that kind of proves your point you just made.
Right.
The salesmen are very smart. They're very good at what they do. It doesn't matter where they are, whether in timeshares, car business, the home business. Salespeople are very good, highly trained to make you buy. And you have this 20-year-old that I've explained, hey, don't go into car debt. And we've had these conversations, him and I. But at the end of the day, he still ended up with a vehicle, and all he knows is how much he pays for it per month.
Yeah, and I'm guessing if it was a buy here, pay here lot, his interest rate was very painful.
Exactly. Yes.
Really, you ought not to be paying $530 a month on a used car. I mean, unless it's like 1 year old or something like that.
Yeah. Well, and my point is, though, at the age of 20, why saddle yourself with that type of debt?
It's significant.
If you just delay gratification a little bit and wait a few years, or however, I mean, I never really had any very nice vehicles till recently, till I was well established and could afford to pay cash and keep my emergency fund. So why would you want to saddle yourself with that significant amount of debt, which would keep you from progressing and getting to your goals? It's just, it's something I would highly avoid if I could.
I mean, what you're really doing is and a buy here, pay here is especially painful because they're usually going to charge you more than the car is worth on the sticker price, So if you think about taking a $7,500 car by the book value, you go to a buy here, pay here, you're going to pay $8,500 for that car. And then you're going to pay probably 20% interest for the life of that loan. You could end up paying almost twice as much as the actual book value of the car by the time you've made all your payments.
Yeah.
I mean, think about that.
Yeah.
And people don't think about that. What they think about is, well, I could swing a $530 a month payment. And that's what the salesmen want you to be planning on. Yeah. They don't want you to think about the rest of it. If you can figure out beforehand what you're willing to spend on that vehicle, including your interest, including what it costs you to finance it, and you go to the dealer with that information in hand, you're going to be able to kind of push back a little bit when they start pushing you towards something that they want you to buy instead of what you can actually afford. So
Do
I
your
think that
research.
you definitely do your research. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up. We've been going, can you believe it, for almost an hour on this. So, we're
That's how much
good
we
at
enjoy
talking.
doing this.
I know it. So it's time for me now to thank all of you for watching, to thank you for listening. If you're listening to this podcast on your favorite directory, and if that's you, we'd encourage you to please subscribe to our feed. If you're listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or someplace where you can give us feedback and rate and review us, please do so. And that goes for you if you're watching us on YouTube or Rumble. Please subscribe. Please leave some feedback, some comments. If you have some questions for us, we'd love to hear from you. If you have some ideas for the show, we would love to work those in. You can reach us at the Purposeful Podcast at convergentdigitalmedia.com. We would love to hear from you. But whether we do or we don't, we hope you'll join us for the next episode. Look out for that next week, same time, same place. Until then, this is the Purposeful Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Purposeful Podcast with Matt Fiebig and Saki Filios. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Make sure to join us on Locals at thepurposefulpodcast.locals.com. And find us on YouTube and Rumble by searching for The Purposeful Podcast. If you like this podcast, don't forget to rate and review. This has been a production of Convergent Digital Media. Visit convergentdigitalmedia.com for more info. Thanks again for listening to The Purposeful Podcast.